Fashion is cyclical. Trends come and go, and then, seemingly inexplicably, return, often with a vengeance. However, the Elizabethan fashion trend of wearing enormous, starch-filled neck garments seems unlikely to come back in style anytime soon. So, today, we're ironing out why big colors were such a fashion statement in the Elizabethan era. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other goofy historical fashions you would like to hear about. All right, gang, let's make like Wu-Tang and protect your neck. Cast your mind back to a time when what you wore determined your place in life and how people treated you. Sure, modern people use clothing to signal what subcultures or cliques we're part of, but back in Elizabethan times, well, they just did things differently, namely wearing massive collars and ruffs. Donning the large, ornate collars was initially a sign of aristocracy, but with that privilege came discomfort. The collars in question, often referred to as ruffs, didn't allow for ease of movement, sort of like an early Batman costume. It probably didn't come up that often among the big collar crowd, but manual labor wasn't possible when wearing the garment, which they probably used as an out. "Oh, sorry, Prince Frederick. I'd love to help you move, but it's this damn rough. You see?" Even the wealthiest men and women had difficulty eating while wearing ruffs, often adopting extremely long eating utensils in social dining situations. Because when your collar is too big to reach the table, the obvious solution is longer spoons. But for ruff wearers, the impracticality was a feature, not a bug. By wearing large ruffs made out of the finest materials, adorned with lace and decorated with gold, these noble folks demonstrated to the world that they didn't have to perform tasks like those undertaken by commoners. The ruffs were an instant signifier of wealth, opulence, and privilege. Wearing a ruff was an instant shorthand that you had servants to launder, prepare, and maintain your life. They can help Prince Frederick move. The way a ruff affected posture was also part of their significance. While wearing a ruff, men and women had no choice but to keep their heads up, demonstrating confidence and pride. And because ruffs had such social prestige, not wearing one was, in a way, taboo. Consequently, men and women wore ruffs whenever they went out. It is probably hard to go clubbing in one of those things, unless you're a vampire. Maintaining the shape and stiffness of a ruff, also referred to as a gophered frill, because the olden days had the best names for everything, was key to being seen as upper crust in European society at this time. The practice of adding starch to a ruff to assist in this stiffness began in the Low Countries during the mid-1560s. When Mistress Dinge van der Plasse brought starch to England in 1564, she began training garment makers, English women, and other interested parties in how to use starch to stiffen the fabric of their clothes. Notably, van der Plasse's starch was completely transparent. English citizens were initially taken aback, but then quickly marveled at the discovery that adding a starch paste to a freshly washed ruff caused it to stand tall and allowed craftsmen to create intricate shapes by painstakingly folding starched fabric. With the addition of starch, ruffs got bigger and more complex. Wires and boards, hidden behind large folds, were also used to support such architecture. By 1580, ruffs were so large they could extend the entire width of a noble person's shoulders. This was presumably a precursor to the big shoulder pads trend of the 1980s. Without van der Plasse's contribution to English fashion, the entire Elizabethan aesthetic would have been wildly different. Maybe they would have gotten into oversized trucker hats. Just for some context, ruffs initially began as an extension of a man's shirt. As the frilly add-ons grew larger and extended further, they transitioned into an entirely separate accessory. These pieces could be kept, crafted, and constructed, while being removed from the logistical challenge of being tethered to an article of clothing. Ruffs were adopted by women by the early 1560s, and by the 1570s, ruffs could be nothing but lace held together with pieces of bone, wood, ivory, or steel. Ruffs were usually pinned to one's clothing to hold them in place, but could also be tied around one's neck with a drawstring or tassels. Queen Elizabeth was said to have ordered pins by the thousands to accommodate her wardrobe, ruffs included. These collars we think of as being primarily an English fashion trend were, in fact, popular all over Europe. Ruff collars in Spain were made with numerous yards of fabric, with one collar using 42 yards of linen. That's almost half a football field of fussiness. so you know it was quality. In England, the amount of fabric that went into a Tudor ruff varied, with the earliest cartwheel or fan-shaped ruffs using about 6 yards of fabric. When Lady Frances Cobham wrote to Bess of Hardwicke in 1564, she remarked that 10 yards is enough for the ruffs of the neck and hands. Oh, guess m'lady hasn't been to Spain. As the 16th century progressed and ruffs became larger and larger, more and more lace and linen were necessary. During the 1580s, it became common for around 18 yards of material to be used with supporting wire, decorative edging, and elaborate ornamentation. That almost sounds like a parade float. Fashion, like life, is always evolving, so it's only natural that ruffs kept morphing as the decades passed. The next major change to these gophered frills took place during the 1590s. Women began wearing ruffs that were open in the front, essentially framing their entire head while giving them room to bend their necks forward. Some men wore open front ruffs as well, but the style afforded women the opportunity to show off their décolletage. In fact, an open ruff with a figure-enhancing bodice would have been an ideal going-out look for a Tudor woman. Later, from about 1625 to 1650, women also started wearing oval ruffs, or large closed ruffs set in formal tubular pleats spreading laterally over the shoulders. Alright, gonna stick with oval on this one. Usually, an oval ruff was accompanied by a wide-brimmed beaver hat, because nothing says I'm ready to party quite like a beaver hat. Ruffs were fragile, and the material used to construct them could fall apart due to hot weather, rain, or body heat. As a result, many ruffs were a one-time use only. Geez, let's hope that 42-yard collar got brought out for more than one cotillion. And now for the moment you've all been waiting for, Queen Elizabeth. Please keep applause and flash photography to a minimum, as Her Majesty is very old. Coming up on 500 years by our count, Queen Elizabeth I is often thought of as being inextricably linked to the trend of massive collars. Possibly because the whole era is named after her? And that's true, to a certain extent. She wasn't the only one who wore them, but how she wore her ruffs essentially determined the fashion trends of the day. And that's what we call an icon. But that's not all she did for the world of ruffs. She also took things into the legal realm. At one point, the Queen banned the wearing of blue ruffs, on the grounds of having committed the great offense of being disliked by the Queen. Elizabeth just didn't care for them, and therefore, no one else was allowed to wear them either. She also introduced laws about the size of ruffs allowed in public. Judge, jury, and fashion-cutioner. Ruffs were worn by men and women, poor and wealthy, commoners and nobles alike. But when double ruffs appeared on the scene during Elizabeth's reign, she forbade them. Or more accurately, she tried to. When the legal limitations didn't exactly work out like she wanted, she tried to keep the size of ruffs down by tasking Sir William Hewitt, the Lord Mayor of London, with reforming monstrous ruffs and other disorders. Something must be done about these monstrous ruffs, Sir William. In 1580, the new legal order targeted a man named Mr. Hewson, who was caught wearing excess of ruffs in the open street after Easter against Her Majesty's proclamation. The scandal. Hewson refused to stop wearing his large ruffs and appealed to his father-in-law, the Lord Chief Baron, to intercede on his behalf. Even back then, it was more about who you know than what you know. Broadly speaking, this Elizabethan effort to crack down on the size of ruffs was generally ignored in the interest of displaying wealth, garnering attention, and currying position within political and social circles. It's kind of like passing a law against Corvettes. You can try it, but Corvettes are pretty cool, man. Throughout this time period, ruffs were worn by men and women alike. However, this fashion trend underwent a significant change during the early 17th century. With the development of the falling ruff, pleats were attached to the neckline of a garment and allowed to hang over one's shoulders. Falling ruffs were not uncommon for men, but around 1615, women began to wear them as well. These ruffs functioned more like small capes than the traditional collars we've been talking about. They could be unstarched and were obviously more comfortable to wear. With this evolution, there was no going back. The fashion trend of bulky, uncomfortable collars was soon to be at its end. Despite having a solid 70-year run, the European ruffs, popularized by Queen Elizabeth in England and King Philip in Spain, have not quite had their comeback moment yet. Maybe there's an enterprising individual watching this video right now who has a can full of aerosol starch and wants to make a statement. Or maybe some fashion trends are best left in the past, like the popped collar and backwards visor combo. What were we thinking? So what do you think? What's the most regrettable fashion trend you've ever followed? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.